Hello and welcome to another episode. This is our edition on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as such will not follow the normal 2-week pattern of this podcast, so we should expect more content from us coming very soon. If you want to keep up with this conflict or any other of the news events that we cover, please consider liking and subscribing wherever you're listening to this podcast. In today's episode, we will go over the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as I have said, how it started, how it's going, and what we should expect in the coming days and weeks. So, without further ado, I'm Joe Sant.
And I'm Akash Lush.
And this is Mildly Interesting.
Mildly Interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.
I just wanted to start off saying that this episode is being recorded on the later hours of the 27th of February, and information about this topic keeps coming in at a very rapid pace. So, by all means, do not take everything we say as fact or final, because there might be a lot of sort of updates to everything we say. So, Akash, firstly, how surprised about all this are you? Before we go into anything, how surprised about it are you?
I didn't think it would actually come to this. We reported on the border tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and it looks stupid now in hindsight, whatever I said. I believe I said I think it would end in a stalemate. Was at a loss for words when, we woke up to the news that at 4 a.m. that Russia had invaded, that they had launched a full-scale military operation, land, air, and sea, into Ukraine. Very much surprised.
I recall we both reported and gave our opinions saying that we didn't think a full-scale invasion could happen. And I feel like that's been shared by a lot of people. On the early hours of February the 24th, after a military buildup that started in early 2021, Putin announced a military intervention on Ukrainian soil as a means to, as he says it, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. This last claim, of course, being false, considering the very small Nazi presence in the country. And on the topic of false claims, Putin has also accused Ukraine of being involved in a mass genocide of Russian people, also false. The first places hit by Russian forces included key airports and military headquarters, and in the past few hours leading up to this recording, Russia has steadily advanced towards the capital of Kiev, with bombings being reported as we speak, as they break through the defenses of Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. Now, President Zelensky has indicated that serious losses have already been suffered, with at least 200 people have been reported killed. And as you'd expect, countless families are attempting to flee this situation, with more than 120,000 having crossed the border into Poland alone. Now, Akash, this was an invasion that was warned in advance by the US, by NATO, by a lot of people. And it, like we said, it's still surprising. Why is it still surprising, giving into consideration that we had a very big warning?
I think it's because deep down, none of us wanted to truly accept the fact that Putin was going to send military into Ukraine. None of us wanted to believe that the possibility of a World War III was looming over our heads. We all saw the build-up, and, Russia and NATO trying to influence countries, that's nothing new, really. Ever since the Warsaw Pact was disestablished, NATO has kind of been assimilating all of the old, Eastern Bloc countries. I think this is Putin's last kind of a cornered animal move to try and cling on to the power that, Russia, the influence that Russia used to have. The outcome was going to be, if Russia invaded Ukraine, that's it. NATO gets involved, the whole world gets involved, China gets involved, like all the big players with nuclear weapons gets involved, and it's just a conflict that we haven't seen since the 20th century. I think Russia invading Ukraine was a surprise, but also a lot of people expected other countries to join in sort of readily. I think another surprise was the fact that no other country has pledged direct military response. It's mostly economics and political sanctions, which, some people may criticize that, but they do have some harsh effects. I believe the US, the EU, a lot of the Western powers have cut off most, if not all, of Russia's central banks' access to the main international financial resources. So they are trying their best to cripple Russia in any way other than militaristic.
Yeah, you're touching there really on the reaction by the major countries, the major players, and just for context, as you said, countries such as the US have included very large economic sanctions, and the US State Department said it will send $350 million in weapons, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft systems, and body armor. And it's become very clear from the US and other countries that they refuse to send troops to Ukraine, focusing those that it already has on the ground in the protection of the countries that border Ukraine. So they want to reinforce NATO borders rather than help Ukraine out. And we see this reaction from all the other countries, really. We see this reaction from France. We see this reaction from the EU as an entity. We see this reaction from the German government, from the Dutch government as well. However, I will say, and I saw this report, and I only saw one report of this fact, so I might be wrong, but I saw that the UK is not only sending humanitarian, military, and financial supplies to Ukraine, but it's also deploying 1,000 troops. And not only the EU and the UK, but a whole lot of countries also said that they will start taking refugees, which, in my opinion, is obviously a good thing. Do you think that this response by all of these countries has been adequate?
We might be getting ahead of ourselves on the timeline, but there is a planned peace talks between Ukrainian delegations and Russian delegations near the Belarusian border. So maybe we can say that these sanctions have been enough. However, I do believe that, like you said, it's been very much because Ukraine isn't a NATO member yet, so it does seem like NATO is prioritizing its own members, which I guess that's the point of a defensive pact. But the videos and the footage coming out of Ukraine, it is very startling. I think the Interior Minister came out recently and said about 350 so civilians have been killed. Obviously, thousands upon thousands have been displaced at the borders. Poland's accepting refugees. I think the Danish government said it would accept a lot of refugees as well. We've seen footage of Ukrainian people just lining up in droves to sign up for the armed forces. Again, there are conflicting reports coming out of Ukraine, because of the back and forth between the propaganda from their military and the propaganda from Russian military. But I did see there was a report saying that men within a certain age range couldn't leave Ukraine because they had to be conscripted because if you compare the military sizes, Ukraine is doing remarkably well considering Russia has 10 times their military manpower.
It is sort of this Dave against Goliath thing that is going on.
Yeah.
Which is why, like yourself, I also thought that if this really breaks out, then there is no way that neighboring countries aren't just going to send military intervention. Especially when it comes to NATO, when it comes to the EU. I thought that, and that's maybe the reason why I didn't think it was going to happen in the first place. I thought that military reaction would be, after a few days of fighting, a resort that would have already come. So I just want to go back to my question earlier. Do you think that the response by all these countries has been adequate? Do you think that what we need is what's being given? Because we see President Zelensky, every day almost, he's asking for more. He's asking for more harsher sanctions, harsher this, harsher that. Do you think that what we already have or are working towards is adequate? Or do you think we need to sort of escalate this to the point that Russia has already escalated it?
It worries me now because there truly is no limit on what Putin is capable of now, or what he's comfortable doing. because we all thought even dictators have limits. But this is Putin poking the bear. Like, we all see Putin as this, massive big bad guy. But let us not forget, he is against all of NATO right now. Pretty much just all of the Western world. Did you see the Taliban came out with a response? They put out an official statement saying, hey, maybe calm down, which was insane to me.
It's insanely ironic because not only the Taliban have said that, China has said that. They have had the same rhetoric saying that all parties involved should look towards a diplomatic way out of this. Now, one of the things that became really clear, and maybe that's why countries are being a bit more skeptical about military intervention, is that Putin has outlined very clear threats. In the very first day before the invasion, he said that any country that would stand against Russia would, and I'm quoting here, face consequences like never before, right? Just hours before we've recorded this episode, Putin has ordered Russia's military to be put on its deterrent forces, which include nuclear weapons, right? So I guess my follow-up question is, do you still think there is a diplomatic way out of this?
No. While countries are still trying to get through to diplomacy, I do believe Emmanuel Macron, the French president, attempted to phone Putin in the early stages of the invasion, and according to the Kremlin, Putin did not back down, and in fact gave Macron an exhaustive list of explanations as to why he was invading Ukraine. So you can understand where other leaders are coming from, because they don't necessarily want to join this war, this conflict, because it's a standoff. If they join, then who's to stop other superpowers or other big players from joining Russia's side?
And who's stopping Russia from using their most powerful weapons as well?
Exactly. Because if Putin was okay giving the go-ahead to invade Ukraine, once other people join in, what is his next move? Like, it seems like he will stop at nothing against those who he views are standing in his way. I genuinely don't think sanctions, I don't think there's a political way out of this per se. I do genuinely believe everyone is going to have to bully Putin into submission almost. If it's not by military means, it's going to be by crippling his economy somehow. We've seen anti-war protests not only in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Europe. We've seen it in Russia itself. Russia has detained, I think, roughly about 1,400 of its own citizens for disrupting peace by having pro-Ukraine protests not only in Moscow but also in St. Petersburg. I think the only way you calm Putin down is you either turn his own people against him, which is quite hard because, as me and Santos have actually discussed off camera, while there are anti-war protests in Russia, there are also people who believe in what Putin is doing. The Russian propaganda machine is very difficult to outmaneuver. I think it's just going to get to the point where countries will have to impose harsher and harsher sanctions until it almost becomes like a North Korea situation where you have to isolate Russia from the international community.
What I'm afraid here of, even more than I am of, Ukraine being taken, which is very likely, what I'm really afraid of is China, because we don't know what China is going to do yet. They've been in support of Putin, but it has been only on a vocal level. They haven't done anything to sort of prove that loyalty per se. So if China joins, there's also a very good chance that countries from the CSTO in the Middle East will also join. And at this point, it is really a full-blown world war. So it is really scary to think that China is just that kind of player that's just there. And I really want to focus a little bit on China because, and this might be a bit of a conspiracy theory from myself, but we saw Putin go to China before the Olympic Games.
Yes.
I think we can all sort of make out what the conversations were like. He was either almost asking for a permission to do it, or just like ensuring that China would be on his side in case of an invasion.
China at this point is almost in a very comfy position. They are kingmakers essentially. You can impose all the financial sanctions you want on Russia, but China is the biggest market in the world. So if Russia is still doing business with China, arguably it could still stay afloat. It's the same with military. China has one of the biggest militaries. So if China joins Russia's side in military support, that might make things a bit dicier. Like you said, China could use this as an excuse. It could either join with Putin because they themselves have not the best human rights record. Let's leave it at that. But they could also maybe help the West put pressure on Putin by, I don't know, exchanging it for recognizing them as the only China and delegitimizing Taiwan. Just before we move on, I wanted to add another, not kingmaker, but dark horse in this scenario, India. Because the UN Security Council had an emergency meeting, and obviously Russia vetoed everything. But on the voting floor, China abstained from the vote, and India also abstained from the vote. So India, again, it's another heavily populated country, big market, quite a strong military. So we don't necessarily know what's going on there as well, but it is like you have these two. You do have these two dark horses, and Putin actually congratulating India on making an informed decision to abstain from the vote. So you have these two dark horses that you just don't know what could happen, and them not supporting, them not putting pressure on Russia is almost helping Russia in a sense.
I do agree with you 100%. It'd be interesting in the next few days and weeks to see how these two players sort of develop their relationship to this conflict. But to bring it back to Ukraine, I think we should talk a little bit about President Zelensky, because a few years ago he was a comedian, right? And when he ran for presidency, a lot of people mocked him for that, saying that he couldn't do it. Now he's the face of Ukraine, really. And do you think he's doing a good job?
If there's one thing he's doing right, it is being the face of Ukraine. It is getting people rallied and getting people behind the movement that is to defend Ukraine's independence. There was a news article, I believe. I think the US government offered Zelensky evacuation, basically said, we'll help you get out of your country. And Zelensky, allegedly, he replied, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're telling me that he's become a good wartime leader in this case.
Yeah, yes, he's definitely a symbol that people can rally behind. Obviously, I didn't dive too much into his politics or his history. I knew about the whole comedian thing. Apparently he played a teacher who accidentally became president, and then he became president. So that was just an interesting story I found really funny. But from what I've been hearing and what he's been saying and the addresses he's been making, because the Russian propaganda machine obviously wants to try and dismantle Ukrainian leadership, but he's been making statements from Kiev, from the capital, saying, I'm not leaving, I'm still here, we need boots on the ground, come help us fight. I think in that regard, he's been doing very well.
If we sort of enlarge the scope a little bit, obviously this is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it's also a conflict, as we mentioned, between Russia and the rest of the Western world, per se, right? So how dangerous do you think this invasion is for European security? Do you think that this should Putin get away with this or successfully take over Ukraine? Do you think it takes credibility away from NATO and the UN? Do you think that sort of is what Putin wants? Sort of not necessarily to have Ukraine, but to make a stand and say, I am a big player in European politics and you should listen to me.
This is definitely him testing the waters almost. It feels weird to say that given the context, but I think he realizes no one wants a full-scale war, basically rope in the whole world. He's chosen Ukraine as his target because, one, the Ukrainian government is no longer under Russian influence, and two, they're not in NATO quite yet. I believe he knew he wasn't going to get what he wanted, which was Ukraine not joining NATO. So he struck out before Ukraine could join, because he knew, it seems very calculated, because it seems like he knew NATO wasn't going to rush to their aid directly. They were going to shore up their defenses and stuff. So it seems, because we've seen Putin make similar statements to the Nordic countries as well, and some of the other Baltic states, saying that if you join, please be warned. He's basically saying, this is what you do if you don't listen to me. This is your fate. And if he should get away with it, no, absolutely not. As long as he's ruling Russia, there should be the harshest sanctions upon him, his government. He should face, I think Boris Johnson, he probably isn't the first one to say this, but he claimed in Parliament, Russia and whoever orders Russian military men into Ukraine should face criminal war charges, should be classed as a war criminal. I believe that's what should happen.
Yeah, but I just want to go back to the sanctions then, because you mentioned that Putin and his government should be awarded the harshest sanctions possible. But wouldn't you say, in that case, that these sanctions are not really hurting Putin that much? They're hurting those on the ground, they're hurting the people of Russia. And if that's the case, then how desirable are these sanctions?
The only way you can really get to a man like Putin is if you make the war undesirable for its people. Putin is a stereotypical strongman authoritarian in charge of arguably the biggest country on earth. His whole regime balances on the fact that he has the support of the people, that he feels like he's in control. What he's basically done in this war is demonize his own country, is demonize the very word Russia. And we've seen citizens speak out against him. Sure, there's still citizens in support of him, but I think that's the purpose of these sanctions. Because you can never hurt Putin. You can't touch the man. Every opposition leader who has tried to has died or mysteriously jailed or has fled the country. So it feels like this is the next best thing without escalating it any further. It's try and put pressure on the people and show them Putin's not doing something nice. He's doing something that the whole world is condemning.
Couldn't you argue then that the same sort of pressure, perhaps not to this extent, but the same sort of pressure was put to Russia in the 2014 annexation of Crimea? And if that's the case, we would probably assume, and we would definitely be right to assume, that a lot of people don't like Putin in Russia. I would imagine that a lot of people see through the propaganda that they are shown every day. But they can't really speak out for it. And what makes you think that this will be any different?
I think when Russia annexed Crimea, obviously there are parallels to the whole thing, but I do truly believe that this is different because this feels more violent. It feels more aggressive.
It is definitely different. I do agree with you that it is different. But what makes you think that it will be able to reach the point where Putin cannot just jail the protesters or kill them?
If I want to give my honest opinion, no matter what happens, it feels like can't really touch Putin. And it feels like everyone's playing a waiting game until he inevitably dies, or everyone around him goes, this guy's a psychopath, we need him out. If I'm being honest, it has to have some sort of effect on the way he's governing Russia, on the way he governs Russia and commands it from now on. If I've learned anything from his annexation of Crimea, is that Putin keeps on dipping his toe into the water even when he's told not to. And it feels like where he's at as the strongman dictator of Russia, you can't really touch him. At least, like, not anytime soon. It does feel like the whole world is just riding out the storm, waiting for him to die of old age or whatever, or for everyone around him to wake up and realize he's a psychopath, he should not be in charge. But until that point, the most we can do is try and turn his own people against him, which gives him less support to keep on pulling off these crazy military maneuvers. Because we saw the annexation of Crimea, and we saw people protest, and we saw sanctions, and Russia calmed down a bit. And obviously, this all built up to now, this week, where Russia just launched a full-scale military invasion. And we've seen outcry across the whole world. I don't believe the sanctions that we impose or the war criminal charges that we impose on Putin will get him out of power. I genuinely believe he is ex-KGB, he has all the skills to manipulate, and he has the propaganda behind him. He has the connections and the skills to keep in power. What I am hoping for, and what I truly believe will happen, is that because of all the information, like information is so widespread now, because of how pretty much every country except maybe China and Belarus and India for some reason, how all countries are condemning this violent act. What I'm hoping for is this makes him realize he doesn't have allies backing him up, and he can't keep pulling this off. He doesn't have the support to keep pulling this off. Because let's say he invades Ukraine, let's say he gets what he wants, right? Or maybe let's say there's a peace deal or something. What's he gonna do next? Everyone remembers him as the guy who invaded Ukraine. That's not gonna go away anytime soon. Who's he gonna pick on next? Because he's made an enemy of everyone. So, like I said, he's probably gonna stay in power, sadly, but I'm hoping the sanctions and all the responses to his invasion cripples the support that he has, so he can't pull this off again.
I just have one last question for you, and I will be answering it after. Using the best of our speculation, how do you think that this conflict will proceed in the next few months, weeks, days?
I can give it my best guess. Like I said, my initial judgment was that, nothing was ever going to happen. This was going to end in a stalemate. My hope is Russia realized that Ukraine has the popular support, has the international community support, and will agree to a ceasefire and a talk where maybe, I don't know, some sanctions are lifted. Maybe Ukraine promises not to join NATO for a certain amount of time, and, Russia pulls out of Ukraine and they demilitarize the border. My hope is that all parties come together, they negotiate something where both sides get a little something they want, and this whole conflict can be over. I cannot see this conflict ending with Putin losing, because like I said, I feel like he needs to gain something from this now. Like, he's gambled everything, he needs to gain something. But at the same time, I do not see NATO letting Ukraine fall without some sort of military intervention.
I would be inclined to agree with you on certain points. I do think that Putin has to win something for this to end. But I think that's something... Maybe I'm a bit more of a pessimistic kind of guy, where I think that in the next few days, maybe weeks, we will see Kiev fall to the Russian. And I don't necessarily think that Putin wants control of Ukraine or doesn't want to be in Ukraine. But I do think that without military help, without military intervention, there is no way that Kiev stands against Russia. And they have been fighting very, very, very bravely. They have been putting up a hell of a fight. But I don't think there's any way that without help from the international community, more like to a certain extent that isn't just sanctions or giving him military equipment, I don't think there's any way that Kiev will stand past the next few weeks at max. And now, I did predict that this would never have happened, so I don't have the back track record, and I do hope I'm wrong. But until then, I do think that Kiev stands a small chance if it is just Kiev by itself. So that wraps it up for our edition on this conflict. Do keep an eye on our podcast and written articles on our website to follow up on this story. Like I said in the beginning, there will be a lot of updates coming soon as this event unfolds. If you like what you've heard, make sure to like and follow our podcast wherever you're listening from, as well as follow us on all the social media platforms down in the description. Now, without further ado, I was João Santos.
And I was Akash Losh.
This was Mildly Interesting.